All right, welcome everybody. I'm sure a few people will continue to stream in as the time goes on, and that's all right. They can just drop in whenever they're able to get the video started. But we're going to go ahead and get started because it's that time. For those of you who haven't met me, I am Danielle DiGiacomo. I'm the director at the Carpenter Museum. And welcome to the Carpenter Museum's 2020 Speaker Series. This is our third installment, our first Zoom installment, and I'm really excited to see how this goes and like how we can use this great technology to reach even more people than we normally would reach if it wasn't a special time where Zoom meetings were necessary. For this speaker series, it's Turbulent Times in Early Rehoboth, Obadiah Holmes and his Baptist friends. Just a little housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. There will be a 5-minute intermission to allow attendees to refill their cups, go to the restroom, do whatever they need to do in the middle of the lecture. There will also be a question and answer portion of the presentation, but we'll do that at the end. Towards the end of the lecture, I will open up the chat window. You see along the bottom of your screen, there will be a chat option. If you could go ahead and type your question into there, she'll be happy to answer questions at the end. That way everything will be streamlined and your question will be sure to be seen. Today's lecturer is author and genealogist Sherry Fletcher Bamberg. Mrs. Fletcher Bamberg is a fellow of the prestigious American Society of Genealogists and is the author of 5 books on Rhode Island families, including John Clark's World. She is also the editor of Rhode Island Roots, a quarterly published journal by the Rhode Island Genealogical Society. And without further ado, Sherry Fletcher Bamberg, everyone.
Thank you very much, Danielle. In the interests of full disclosure, I have to admit that you all, dear listeners, are surely much more knowledgeable about Rehoboth than I am. I'm a Rhode Island girl, and I beg your indulgence during this talk. Now, we know that Rhode Island was founded, or Rehoboth was founded in the 1640s when other parts of Plymouth Colony were already very well established. The first land was bought in 1643, first real development in 1645. Now, we all know that the borders of Rehoboth have changed in bewildering ways, but that's not why I'm showing you this map. I want you to look at this area in particular, because I have a feeling that Rehoboth was set up for controversy just by its geography. Plymouth powers could have seen settlement as a bulwark against contamination of those ridiculous Rhode Island ideas, such as toleration of religion. On the other hand, residents would be dangerously close to a hotbed of heresy, that blot on the religious landscape, Providence. Now, Rehoboth was set up in a way that was much more organized and well thought out than any town in Rhode Island at the time. Towns in Rhode Island had been set up by people who were fleeing from Massachusetts. And they weren't very well thought out in advance, I have to admit. But we know that it was carefully planned. It was laid out in divisions. They planned a school, they planned a meeting house, planned to get the usual tag team of congregational ministers, a preacher, and a teacher. There were rules, lots and lots and lots of rules. When and where you were to put up fences, how close to the road you could cut down trees, where you could keep goats. What happened if your beasts got into the planting fields? not good. How much a man and a team of oxen could charge for a day's work. Most importantly, though, you had to go to church, not your choice of church, but the one Congregational church. Now, Rehoboth was lucky as this new town in attracting a distinguished teacher, a man who was remarkably learned and experienced. While he was in Rehoboth, Samuel Newman published his huge concordance of the Bible. This is a book you would not want to drop on your foot. He knew what it felt like to be persecuted. One of the kindest summaries of his character is this: he was, for a New England clergyman, a peace-loving, scholarly man, mild and prudent in his natural disposition. I guess I just don't know him that well, but I don't see much evidence of that natural disposition on display in Rehoboth. About 4.5 years after Rehoboth had been founded, Roger Williams in nearby Providence wrote this letter to his friend John Winthrop, November 10th, 1649. It was the first crack in the foundation, and this absolutely fascinates me. The identity of the Providence men is unknown. John Clark and John Luker were not from Providence, they were from Newport, part of John Clark's emerging Baptist church. So what was this dipping that Roger Williams was talking about? And what was wrong with new baptism? It wasn't John Clark's idea or Roger Williams' idea. It had come from England. It had been floating around New England for a little under 10 years. The idea was that baptism should be practiced as it had been in the Bible, that it should be a ceremony for an adult capable of consenting. In eastern Massachusetts Bay, there were lots of people who refused to let their children be baptized. This was a court matter. They were fined, then whipped if they did, still refused, and sometimes banished. And why were they so upset? Well, think about it. If infant baptism wasn't any good, then all those pious people in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Colony weren't really baptized. Yikes. All those thousands of babies who had died young were destined for a very warm afterlife. Now, baptism by total immersion was a separate idea that had come to Newport just that year with the newly arrived Baptist Mark Luker. Again, it recalled baptism in the Jordan. Opponents such as this, the author of this book called The Dipper Dipped, like to pretend that naked people were frolicking in rivers and ponds, having a high old time. We will come back to this criticism. So who were these people who were baptized at Seekonk, as Roger Williams called it? We don't know. We don't even know for sure how many there were. Some sources say 8, some say 13. These are the people who got into trouble in court for Baptist ideas later. And I think it's highly likely that these were the people who were baptized that day. William Carpenter is separated from the rest because after his first court appearance, he buckled and he went back to church and he apologized. And, you know, I'm with you, Mr. Newman. It's a very, very interesting list. Obadiah, the people are from different parts of Old England, and they had been in very different places in New England. Joseph Torrey and Edward Smith and their wives had been with Newman, and they had come from Weymouth, Massachusetts to Rehoboth. John Hazel was the oldest person in the group and a very fascinating man who had lived there before Rehoboth was Rehoboth. And I kind of thought that he was some kind of kook living out in the wilderness, but he really was not. He was a learned man who knew English law, and he had a remarkable library of theological books inventoried in his house after he died. But I'm going to be talking about Obadiah Holmes. Why? He's the only person in the group who wrote about his spiritual journey. It's in Ill News from New England. It's in his On My Life that he wrote later. It's true that he left out a lot of details that historians and genealogists would love, but his words give us a window into his soul. Then too, he's the one who had the most dramatic story, a genuine American martyr who influenced history. Was he a nice person? Would you have wanted to invite him to dinner? Well, that's for you to decide. He was remarkably stubborn, which was endearing if you shared his beliefs, but kind of exasperating if you didn't. Now, he was born in Lancashire in the northwest part of England. He was born in the little village of Redditch, but baptized in Didsbury. If you wanted to go to the church where he was baptized, I'm sure they'd be happy to see you because it's still there. He was baptized 18th of March, 1610 at St. James. I have to say, though, that church did not stick. He wrote later, I, the most rebellious of all the children in his family, did neither hearken to counsel nor any instruction, for from a child I minded nothing but folly and vanity. I was not only rebellious against my parents, but against the Lord. Continuing in such a course for 4 or 5 years, my rebellion to my honored parents then looked me in open face. And I have to stop for a minute because one of the things that's so interesting about him is the way he uses language and the images that he creates. The rebellion looked him in open face. And my dear mother being sick, it struck me my disobedience caused her death, which forced me to confess the same to her, my evil ways and danger. We know when his mother died, it was 1630, so that crisis in his life can be dated to 1630. She died and is buried here outside Manchester, what is now Manchester Cathedral. Later that year, on the 20th of November, he married Catherine Hyde in this same church. Catherine has no lines in this play, but she seems to me to have been a trooper. She stuck with her husband through rare patches of thick and a whole lot of thin, uprooting herself and her family over and over. She gave Obadiah 9 children, and she gave him the emotional support to do what he did. Now, this is not a picture of the Holmes family, sadly. There is no picture of the Holmes family or any member of the Holmes family. But it was painted in England in the 1640s. The symbolism of the child at the bottom suggests that he had died. You see the skulls, he's not clothed the way the other children are. The mother is pointing at him. Obadiah and Catherine were to leave an infant son, John, buried in England. What happened next? Well, Obadiah was fathering children and working in his craft, to be sure, but he never mentions those activities. In On My Life, written in 1675, Holmes describes his quest for spiritual peace and constant struggles with Satan. Finally, he reached the point where he was willing to love him meaning Jesus, and part with all for him, my dear honored father, brethren, friends, house and land, and my own native country. He and Catherine sailed in 1638. Holmes tells us that he determined to adventure the dangers of the seas to come to New England, where he could avoid the popish relics of bishops. He and Catherine were part of the Great Migration, and like almost all Great Migration immigrants, they sailed into Boston. What did they find there? Well, Massachusetts Bay was not exactly a theocracy. Ministers could not be government officials. Still, most colony officials belonged to the First Church of Boston. Here are the founders of the First Church, Congregational, of course, signing the covenant. There are some anachronisms on this relief, which is in the Congregational Library in Boston, but the sense of stern commitment to their beliefs has truth. You had to be an active member of the Congregational Church in your town to become a freeman. That means to vote. Religious dissent was seen as a criticism of the government, something deeply anarchic. Obadiah, Holmes, and Catherine moved north. They went to Salem, not because of any disagreement about religion, but because it had the raw materials that he needed for his craft. He was a glassmaker. This was really exciting for Essex County. The only other place in America where glass was being made was Jamestown, Virginia. It wasn't that there was a rule against it. Samuel Reeder explained in a letter from England in March 1636, the glassmen will not undertake to go over till there be a clay found out fit for them in the country, lest they should be a burden to those that transport them, or else live miserably. He didn't really mean clay, but you had to have sand and oyster shells and potash. Now, Essex County folks were really excited about this, and they gave land for a glass house to Obadiah Holmes, his partner Solomon Southwick, and he had another partner for a while. Well, why did they give him land way out in the boonies? If you think about it, I think it probably wasn't a good idea to have a furnace among all those little wooden houses in Salem. Working with Solomon Southwick, he went into the glass business, and bits of glass were found in the farmers' fields in this area into the 19th century. Many of them are at the Peabody Essex Museum, but since they have 19 million objects, they couldn't find it when I wanted to show them to you, I am sorry to say. So, what does a glassmaker do? When I want to learn about somebody, I really like to take a deep dive into their lives. This image is from Jamestown, but it shows things you need. You needed a kiln, you needed a rod, a hollow metal tube, and you needed this bench. This is just a cartoonish image from Jamestown, from the Jamestown website. But if you want to see what it's really like, there is a absolutely wonderful 15-minute video on YouTube. Wait, if you want to write it down, this link. It's an English video with splendid accents, the people in period clothing, and it shows how really hard glassmaking is. You had to start the night before, take the logs nice and dry, and put them inside here. There's a inner tub inside in which you put the raw materials. You'd have this fire going all night. In the morning, you'd go around on the back of this and you'd take out the loose bricks on the side and stick your rod in, swizzle it in the melted glass, and then quickly jump up and sit down in the chair. You'd use this hand to roll it and the other hand to hold kind of like a scoop, and that would make it round enough so that you could then blow into it. it wasn't very easy to make flat glass, and most of what he made was window glass, just small pieces that were set into leading. If you think about the fact that before this time, all the glass in all the houses in Salem had been imported from England, which means that a lot of houses didn't have glass because the people couldn't afford it. In January of 1639, Obadiah Holmes and his wife, and Solomon Southwick and his wife, joined the First Church of Salem. Looking online, I found umpteen pictures that had nothing to do with each other of the First Church in Salem. I have no idea which one Obadiah Holmes would have recognized, but it might have been one of these. Now, this church was the first church in Massachusetts Bay, Salem being founded before Boston. One of its faithful members and one of its founders was John Endicott, the once and future governor of the colony. Remember that name. 3 Holmes children were baptized in the first church, 1640 through 1644. So Obadiah Holmes had a business. He had land, he had a church, he had a family. How was it going? Well, he had not found what he was looking for. Here's another image that he used repeatedly to describe his spiritual state. He'd feel happy and then he'd feel depressed, and one day he would think he had found exactly what he was looking for, and the other, it was not. And things just kept getting worse. Finally, and we don't know exactly when, this word was written next to his name on the original members list. Now, it had to have happened after June 1644 and probably before January, because he could not have had the child baptized if he had been excommunicated. This excommunication text was pronounced in the First Church of Boston on a woman who had quarreled with a fellow church member over a carpenter's bill. So it wasn't always doctrinal, but everything else we know about Obadiah Holmes suggests that it probably was. So if you were excommunicated, it just didn't mean you just couldn't go to church. You were actively shunned by every church member, and remember that most people in the town had to belong to the church. And that wasn't all. You were literally sent to the devil. This was a very serious thing that had been voted on had to be approved by every member of the church in the open church. So Obadiah Holmes had already been looking over the horizon. He bought an option on land in Plymouth Colony in 1643. He had moved there by June 1645. He was never to make glass again. He would have to build a house, he'd have to learn how to farm, and he'd have to find a new trade. We know that later in life, he was, in fact, a weaver. I do not know whether he was a weaver in Rehoboth. Here is the land that he was given. You'll notice there's a red dot, and we'll come back to those later. Those are the fellow schismatics. He joined the Congregational church. Now you may say, but he was excommunicated. How could that be? Well, you could get over excommunication by living a blameless life for 6 months and then admitting your fault. Oh, mea culpa, making a new confession of faith. In June 1645, he was granted Lot 57 in the Great Plain Division. Well, that was good news. His minister, Samuel Newman, had Lot 56. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as you can imagine, a whole lot. Um, in 1649, Holmes and Newman were fighting in court. Holmes sued Newman on the grounds that the minister had slandered him in a previous court session. And that probably was in the spring, but there is no record of it. Newman had said that Obadiah had perjured himself. On October 29th, 1649, does that remind you of any other date you've heard? Holmes won in court, not just the moral victory, but 100 pounds. Now, there isn't an explanation in the court records, but Holmes explained that he argued that 7 of the 23 church members could not pass an act of admonition. That was the first step in excommunication, without the consent of the rest. He went to Newman to tell him the evil he had done. Can you imagine this? Here's this Oxford graduate who's been a minister forever, and this guy who was excommunicated and never gone to college was telling him he'd done evil. He was not thrilled. So we know from Roger Williams' letter that by 2 weeks later, Clark and Luker had dipped Seekonk residents. This was not done surreptitiously or on the spur of the moment. Holmes says, "The day was known when we intended to be baptized, and yet not one man or woman of Mr. Newman's company ever came to deal with me for evil, neither in judgment or in practice, until long afterwards." In June 1650, Holmes and others were arrested for setting up a, quote, separate and irregular church meeting in opposition to the orderly and approved and established congregation led by Reverend Samuel Newman. The arrested people were not called Baptists. They were called schismatics. In other words, they were causing a schism in the church. In October, the court, including the leaders of Plymouth Colony, and look at the names of these people. It's just amazing to think of them all in the one room with Obadiah Holmes, ordered them to desist and neither to ordain officers, nor to baptize, nor to break bread together, nor yet to meet upon the first day of the week. Well, how did Obadiah Holmes see this? The court, he says, straightly charged us to desist, yet it pleased the Father of mercies to give us strength to stand and to tell them it was better to obey God rather than man. You can imagine how popular that was. This was getting boring. Now, this precise date of excommunication is not clear, but it was brought up against him in 1651. He says that he was accused of baptizing Goodwife Bowdish naked. Holmes said that she had comely garments from head to toe, as those who were there, including her husband, could testify. Now, you notice he didn't say he hadn't baptized her, just that she wasn't naked. A layman baptizing? Yikes. You cannot tell me that Newman did not take pleasure in pronouncing this dire sentence. Now, we have a 7th inning stretch. I will see you all in precisely 5 minutes. Thank you. Hey, Paul, can you come and help me for Okay, let's get going again. The Baptists in Rehoboth were just trying to figure out what they should do. 1651 was a very unusual year because it saw both civil and religious upheaval. The civil upheaval didn't affect Rehoboth, but Rhode Island's very existence was threatened. William Coddington had gotten Parliament to give him a new commission, proclaiming him governor of Aquidneck Island for life. This effectively split the colony in half, north, Warwick and Providence, and south, Newport and Portsmouth. The religious upheaval surely upset Rehoboth residents who cherished their church and honored their learned minister. The emerging cluster of Baptists people were trying to decide, do we conform? Heaven forbid, literally. Do we move to Rhode Island where we can worship as God moves our hearts? They were certainly looking at that. There was a third option, some big public event that would reach many people. This sentence was written by John Hazel to Samuel Hubbard, one of the members of Clark's church in Newport. The decision, probably made in Newport, was to make a grand gesture of civil disobedience. Plymouth was too tolerant to create a public scandal. Obadiah Holmes had been in court, and there had been fines, there had been mild punishment, but nothing serious. John Clark and John Crandall of Newport and Obadiah Holmes of Seekonk were going to do something very provocative in Massachusetts Bay. They were going to go to Essex County, to the coastal town of Lynn, near Salem, I must say, to visit William Witter. William Witter was a stubborn older man with Baptist leanings and links to one of the members of John Clark's church. We're lucky to know precisely where William Witter lived. This is a reconstructed map that was done in the 19th century, but I have found it wonderfully helpful. The men would have walked up from Boston along this road, dropped down here, walked past the First Church of Lynn, along here, down to here, and along Black Will's Cliff, and up to William Witter's house. That amazes me. I found it very exciting to go there. And this is, Black Will's Cliff is still there. It's still called Black Will's Cliff. I had imagined it as being 200 feet high, but in fact, it's only 13 feet high. And now it's all concreted over with steps. Not only do we know where he lived, we know what his house was like. William Witter lived with his wife and his children in a hall and parlor house, not this one that's gone now. And we know everything that was in it thanks to the inventory taken after his death. The three footsore travelers arrived late in the day, no doubt to a warm welcome and a nice dinner. It is safe to say that they had been watched the whole way, the way we would track terrorists today. The next morning, they did not feel moved to go to meeting, and Clark began to preach. The light in the room coming through the diamond-shaped panes would have been dim even in July. The family could probably hear cattle outside and certainly the waves on the shore. Suddenly, bam, 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 the constables were at the door with a warrant for the arrest of all three men. Now just think about getting a warrant on a Sunday morning in Massachusetts Bay. The constables stopped the meeting and, don't laugh, took the three men to Sunday dinner at the Blue Anchor Tavern. On Sundays, you went to church all morning, came home for dinner, then went back for another couple of hours. When the three men set down their forks, the constables coerced them into going to meeting. So off they went. This picture from the First Church website in Lynn does not strike me as very likely accurate, but it's the best we have. The point of this was, I think, to goad them into public behavior for which they could be charged. The three prisoners no doubt saw it as a chance to speak out in public. John Clark told the story in Ill News from New England. At my first stepping over the threshold, I unveiled myself, civilly saluted them, turned into the seat I was appointed to, put on my hat again, and so sat down and opened my book and fell to reading. Holmes and Crandall followed suit. Gasps. The constable was ordered to knock off their hats. Things went downhill fast. The minister's attempt to engage Clark in debate was interrupted by a magistrate, Robert Bridges. It ended with Clark saying that the church was not gathered in the visible order of Christ. The next day, Robert Bridges, the same magistrate, wrote a mittimus to the keeper of the prison in Boston. This was serious. Most church cases were dealt with in Salem. Boston was the only place where the death penalty could be handed out. So the next morning, they were marched off to jail in Boston, a landscape that we cannot really imagine today. Boston then was sticking out in the harbor at the end of a very long, narrow peninsula. It had mountains. It had 3 mountains. And for a while, it was called Tremontan. The only remnant of that left in Boston is Tremont Street. The rickety jail that they were taken to was conveniently close to the first church. Here was the first church, here was the jail. The men stayed there for quite a while before the trial. Now, this was not what you or I would think of as a trial. There was no judge, no jury, no defense attorney, just a bunch of bitter old men railing at the defendants. The preacher who preached a thunderous sermon before they were sentenced affirmed that denying infant baptism would overthrow all, a capital offense, and he called them soul murderers. You notice the chief magistrate was John Endicott, who was pretty familiar with Obadiah Holmes. Sometimes you find a summary of character that just can't be bettered. As far as I can tell, Endicott was shaking with rage through the whole hearing. When it was over, he let loose, being somewhat transported, as Clark said, and shouted that Clark deserved death and he wouldn't have such trash brought into his jurisdiction. Now, if you think about the fact that he actually did sentence Mary Dyer to death 10 years later as a Quaker, you can imagine that this was not a figure of speech. So it will not surprise you inordinately to discover that they were found guilty. They were despite this violent atmosphere at the trial, they were assessed fines on a sliding scale. When I look at these, it seems odd because Clark was definitely the leader and Holmes and Crandall were supporters. And yet Obadiah Holmes has this 30-pound fine. If you look at his sentence, you will get an idea of why. I'm going to give you a little time to read through this because it's a little dense. But this word, this is first of all alleging things that are contradicted in Ill News, saying that there was a communion service, and there was a baptism. These things Clark absolutely denied. But you can see that it was because Holmes was excommunicate that this was a particularly severe punishment. And this describes what denial of infant baptism leads to. An absolutely slippery slope straight to you know where. Naturally, all three men refused to pay their fines because that would be an admission of guilt. Friends of Clark and Crandall paid their fines very much against their will. Obadiah Holmes refused to have his fine paid. Remember what John Hazel said, persecutions and death itself for Christ's sake will be great advantage. Actually, we know a great deal about his decision. On the morning of his whipping, Obadiah Holmes was visited by friends, including John Hazel. He withdrew to pray, but as he said, Satan let fly at me, saying, remember thyself, thy birth, thy breeding, and friends, thy wife, children, name, and credit. Satan put doubt in his mind. Was he doing this for his own sake, his own pride? A voice, as if from heaven, came into his soul, reassuring and refreshing him. He prayed that God would give him a spirit of courage and boldness, a tongue to speak for him, and strength of body to suffer for his sake. Finally, a great peace came to him, and he went cheerfully with the keeper, carrying his testament in his hand. Now, there are a lot of pictures of what happened next, none of them contemporary and all of them quite cheesy, but this one had to have been painted by someone who never read ill news, because it looks as though officials were dragging him to the whipping posts. Yes, there was conflict with Increase Noel, the highest colony official present, but it was verbal. Obadiah Holmes was determined to give an account of his faith in the order he held. Noel was determined not to let him, quote, delude the people. I'm not going to read what Holmes said, as it fills a page and a half of fine print. But to me, the most interesting part of his statement is, I made as much conscience out of unbuttoning one button as I did of paying 30 pounds. Now, this is a popular Victorian image of the preparation for the whipping. I should point out a few things. The whipping post was, in fact, painted red, suggestive of blood. It stood directly in front of the door of the First Congregational Church, not on the side. The second thing is that Holmes is shown with his mouth shut, when in fact he was testifying the whole time. The one thing that this picture gets right is that there was indeed a large crowd gathered, and the other is the three-corded whip, which was also knotted. The executioner, Thomas Bell, spit on his hand so he could get a good grip and gave him 30 lashes. Afterwards, in the best Fox's Book of Martyrs manner, Holmes thanked him and said, "It is as if you have struck me with roses." Remember John Hazel, the fellow who wrote about persecutions and death? In a twist of fate, he was, in the end, the only person who died because of this event. John Hazel was really close to Obadiah Holmes, perhaps sort of a father figure. John Clark said that Hazel was his, quote, near neighbor, lived in the same town together, walked together in the same fellowship and faith of the gospel, and had their hearts knit together in more than ordinary near bond of love. After the whipping, Hazel came up to him in the crowd, silently took his hand. His companion, John Spurs, said, "Blessed be the Lord." The constables, apparently infuriated with the PR failure of the day's proceedings, pounced. They arrested both John Spur and John Hazel and took them to jail, where they lingered for some time. They were eventually sentenced to pay 40 shillings fine each or be whipped. Both refused to pay, but both were rescued against their wills by friends. John Hazel, who was a man at least in his 60s, fell ill on the day he was released, and he went to the house of a Baptist sympathizer, Nathaniel Briscoe, in Watertown, and he died 10 days later, death itself. Obadiah Holmes, meanwhile, was on the way walking back to Seekonk. A new warrant was issued for his arrest. There were, in fact, a total of 13 people arrested in the crowd. So it was considered that he had really created a public disturbance. Although he was bleeding from open wounds, Obadiah Holmes walked back, apparently alone, and said, "I was by the good hand of my heavenly Father brought home." And there's this wonderful image of his family and the townspeople and people of Providence coming way out to meet him on the way. Now, all of this was an ugly story, but it might have just stayed that and only that, save for a coincidence. Roger Williams and John Clark were sent to London to fight to have Coddington's commission revoked. Remember the civil problem with Rhode Island. While they were in London, both men started publishing like crazy. Clark's short book, Ill News from New England, was a bestseller. It went through 2 editions in 1652. The one that I saw was at the John Carter Brown Library in Providence. Now, Ill News contains Clark's version of the events, Obadiah Holmes's long letter to English Baptists describing them, and the accounts of both John Spur and John Hazel about what happened, and of course lots and lots of theology. I am fascinated that John Hazel demanded his right as an English subject to have a trial with a jury, and you know, Clark and Holmes never said anything about that, but Hazel was very bright. The book made Obadiah Holmes a hero, fighting for toleration of religion. It made Massachusetts Puritans look bitterly intolerant, and the whole Puritan colony a failure as an experiment. The light from the city on the hill revealed its flaws relentlessly. Now, how accurate was this book? And not too. How internally consistent were the stories? Not very. And yet it was a smash hit. The Baptists obviously could not stay in Rehoboth. Obadiah Holmes, William Dayball, Edward Smith, and James Mann bought huge acreage near John Clark's farm on Aquidneck Island. This was apparently a joint purchase, although the original deed appears to have disappeared. They probably moved in 1652, all but Holmes became freeman of Rhode Island on the 17th of May, 1653. Holmes became a freeman 3 years later. Deeds in 1658, when they actually split up the land, are very useful to explain what had been achieved in those few years that they had lived there. The deeds mention the Holmes property as having a dwelling house, barn, orchard, and fields. The land was then in Newport, but now it's in Middletown because of the split in the towns. Those of you who are familiar with Aquidneck Island will recognize that this is Second Beach here, and Hanging Rock is over off in this direction. Now, they didn't, although in Rehoboth, they had their own meetings, but they joined Clark's existing church. Church membership was always small, sometimes as few as a dozen. When the Rehoboth people arrived, the majority of members belonged to the extended Clark family. They met in each other's homes. They did not believe in a theologically trained ordained clergy. Members were encouraged to speak as moved by the Spirit, as Quakers are. No clerical garments, no crosses, no candles, no set prayers, no music, no bell, no prayer book. As far as I know, there was the Bible. This is John Clark's Bible, and this was a testament that belonged to one of the members. Various people baptized: Mark Luker, Joseph Torrey, John Crandall, and of course, Obadiah Holmes. Now, you will find some sources that say that Holmes became the pastor during Clark's absence. He was still in London until 1664. Holmes was one of the leaders, of course, but by no means the leader until after a cluster of deaths in 1675-6. Mark Luker, John Crandall, John Clark, and Joseph Torrey all died in that short period. Breaking up is hard to do, but it kept happening in Newport as it did in Providence and even in England. Now, you or I can see this as evolution. For the people who lived through it, these departures seemed like a rip in the precious fabric of faith. The 6 principal Baptists left over a belief in the laying on of hands, and they were to become the dominant Baptist group in Rhode Island. The Sabbatarian split is very well documented. The principal Sabbatarians were members of Samuel Hubbard's family. They became convinced that they should celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday rather than on Sunday. Outside Baptist circles, you have to remember that the Quakers had arrived in the mid-1650s, and in less than 20 years, they had massive numbers of members, and they had political power. What is going to surprise you is that Obadiah, as it did me, I think, Obadiah Holmes himself left. I wish that I could tell you what this was all about. I have no idea at all. All I can say is that people were appalled as far away as England. Thomas Trenick wrote to Samuel Hubbard in 1668, "I hoped I should never have seen the day in which such spirit should be found among you, so full of gall and wormwood as your letter seems, to intimate a difference between you and my dear brother Holmes, whose faithfulness for Christ and his truth has been so long approved among you in many ways." Obadiah Holmes did not leave Newport. He didn't leave the Baptist faith. He traveled to Gravesend, New York, and Monmouth, New Jersey to visit adult children. He had, in fact, been one of the original 12 Monmouth patentees in 1665. He did not go there to live, but 2 sons did. He also traveled to Charlestown, Massachusetts to help the struggling Baptist church there. Imagine that a Baptist church was then possible in Massachusetts, persecuted as it was. This was remarkable. Imagine him going back to Boston. Now, Obadiah Holmes came back to the Newport church in time, and he did lead the church for the last years of his life, but it did remain very small. He died in 1682 and was buried on his own land, a part of Middletown that remains peaceful and beautiful today. He was still as deeply religious as he ever had been. His essay on my faith, written in 1675, includes 35 doctrinal points and the note, For this faith and profession I stand, and have sealed the same with my blood at Boston in New England. John Hazel had been right. Persecution had been an advantage. There had been revulsion on both sides of the Atlantic at the idea of those fleeing persecution turning into persecutors. His very body was a reproach to Massachusetts. I realized after the death of John Lewis this summer that a martyr who lives and bears the physical symbols of his martyrdom is more powerful than one who dies. Rhode Island's Governor Joseph Jenks later wrote, "Those who have seen the scars on Mr. Holmes' back, which the old man was wont to call the marks of the Lord Jesus, have expressed a wonder that he should live." In a way, this often difficult man still lives in Rhode Island, in America's principle of religious liberty. Now, if you are really interested and would like to dive in more deeply, let me recommend some books for you. Baptist Piety has almost all of his writings in it, and this is available on Amazon. Ill News has been printed and reprinted over and over. As far as I can tell, though, the best place to get that now is from Abe Books, ABE Books. And this has John Clark's story and Obadiah Holmes' letter, and a whole lot of pages that I was unable to get through, I must say, at the end. And the last book is the book that I and Judith Crandall wrote in 2018 that sets all of these events in the context of what was happening all across New England and Old England. And there's a link to that on the website. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share. There, hey, what do you know?
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. For all the participants, I have opened the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat now, and Sherry will answer them.
Oh, Jerry will try to answer them.
Yeah.
And if I can't answer them, I'm going to put Judy Harvold on the spot.
Fantastic. We'll give people just a couple of minutes to enter their questions. I see a couple of typers. For the person that asked, can we get a copy of this talk and the slideshow? The video was recorded and it will go up on our website in the coming weeks. So look for it there under the 2020 speaker series page of our website. All right, question. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I was wondering about the Baptists that ended up in Swansea. Is there any documentary evidence to connect the 7 that formed the Swansea congregation to Obadiah?
Only in the sense that there was a lot of correspondence. Judy and I wrote about this. The Swansea group really had a different genesis, because after the Act of Conformity in 1661, the very successful Baptist minister John Miles could not preach in England anymore. He had gone around, he had founded all these churches and inspired a lot of people, and his career in the British Isles was over. And he came to Swansea bringing some of the people from his congregation in Ilford in Wales. No, okay. Well, certainly when you go to the church in Wales, you will find a lovely plaque that shows him as the first minister of that church. And he was a very determined and very interesting man. And one of the things that fascinates me is that he ended up marrying the daughter of somebody who had lived in Essex County way back in the 1640s and had gone back to England. And then she came back to America, which she had left as a child, and married him. But I really have said everything I have to say about Swansea in the book, and I've forgotten what I said, so I think that's where that ends.
All right, another question. Did any of the children remain in the local area? Is his wife's grave with his?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the gravestones. There was no gravestone carver. There are gravestones, and there's even an old gravestone from 1800. He died in 1682. There's also a plaque there. His children did stay. Some of them he had, because he had 9 children, he had a pretty good chance of having some stay. And in fact, the land stayed in the Holmes family for generations, as did the Smiths and the Manns. Smith was very active in John Clark's church and was responsible for saving its records at the time when it was in very serious trouble. So, but it's a lovely place to visit. I think you should take this as a destination because there's a sense of peace about it that you don't find in a lot of places these days. And for those of you who are in Rhode Island, of course, you can't go from Massachusetts to Rhode Island now. Hopefully, one of these days we'll get that back.
I hope so too. All right. Was there any other questions? I don't see anyone raising their hand for me to hold off for them. Well, thank you so much, Sherry. That was an excellent presentation. Very, very interesting and so well done. And I thank you for being our very first Zoom speaker for our speaker series. I think that this went very well. We have one last question here. How many of those attending are related to Holmes? Just, a couple.
Actually, there are a couple of ancestors, Holmes and Ann Hutchinson, who both in any group of New Englanders, you'll usually find about a quarter of the people related to those 2 individuals.
Wow. Wow. All right. Well, thank you very much.
You are welcome.
All right. This concludes.
Bye, everybody.
Afternoon, everyone. Bye. Look for the video in the coming weeks. Bye.
Bye-bye.